There's something most founders carry that doesn't show up in any report or any meeting. And it's really hard to explain to anyone who's never felt it themselves. You can have revenue, a team, meetings, software, and enough going on to make it look like things are still moving. And you still feel like the business is sitting on your chest every day. Questions that should get handled below your level, they still find their way back to you. The standards you thought were solid start going out the window. Second, things get hard, and small issues turn into bigger ones because no one's really sure who's supposed to deal with them. But from the outside, it can look like progress. Inside, it still feels like an elephant on your shoulders. And almost every founder gets the next part wrong. If you don't know who I am, my name's JD Bach. I've been an entrepreneur for over 20 years. And over the last couple of years with past partners, I've helped dozens of 7 and 8 figure founders install the systems they need to actually scale. Through all of this, I discovered one sobering truth. Until the leader has built the capacity to hold them, systems don't stick. That's why I started 9FOS, where I help founders build the leadership capacity, systems, and the operating structure required to scale without everything collapsing back onto them. Also, while leveraging AI to increase speed, leverage, and execution across the business. Because when the leader can't hold the next level, the business can't hold it either. And what I found working with those founders is that the move most of them make when they hit that wall is exactly the wrong one. Most of them figure the business just needs more structure or better managers. Maybe another tool or just more effort from the right people. And to be fair, that makes sense on the surface. When the team feels stretched thin, bringing someone new in looks reasonable. When execution feels like rounding up chickens, software looks useful. When nobody really knows what they're supposed to focus on, throwing more meetings at it feels like it could help. And that's usually where founders make a move that makes everything worse without realizing it. Problems that when something's clearly broken, people reach for visible fixes. So they start adding things before they've actually figured out what's really going on underneath. They bring in people and tools and processes, and the company starts looking more put together from the outside without actually getting any easier to run. So the business gets more sophisticated on the surface, while same weight keeps finding its way back to the founder. And the reason that keeps happening is usually the last thing founders want to hear. Nobody stopped long enough to figure out where the business actually is and what it actually needs next. They just start fixing what they can see. That's exactly what the map is for. The map's a diagnostic tool with 8 stages, and each one represents a real phase in how a business actually develops. Not just how big it gets or how much revenue it does, but how it really operates day to day and who it still depends on to keep things moving. That's exactly what the map is for. The map's a diagnostic tool with 8 stages, and each one represents a real phase in how a business actually develops. Not just how big it gets or how much revenue it does, but how it really operates day to day. And each stage has a dominant constraint, which is basically the one thing doing the most damage right now. Not a list, just the one thing that, if it got fixed, would let everything else start moving along smoother. And each stage has a next structural priority. the one thing that needs to get built before it makes sense to touch anything else. So when a founder goes through the diagnostic, they're really just answering three questions. What stage has this business actually earned? What's the dominant constraint right now? And what needs to get built next? Stage, constraint, next priority. That's it. And once a founder has that, a lot of things that felt confusing start making sense pretty fast. Because businesses don't just need more structure, they need the right things built in the right order, not just more of everything piled on top of what's already there. And that's where most founders lose years, and they just don't get those back. Founders react to whatever's hurting right now. They don't stop long enough to figure out what stage they're actually in and what they've earned, what the real constraint is, or what needs to get built before anything else gets touched. So they end up building from whatever's on fire instead of what the business actually needs next. And you can feel exactly when that's happening. I'm sure you've seen this. Someone on your team just hits a wall. Maybe it's a client issue, maybe it's an internal decision that needs to get made. They probably could handle it, but nobody ever drew the line clearly enough for them to know for sure it's theirs. So they shoot you a message instead of risking it. And of course, you answer quickly. Because let's be honest, sometimes it feels easier than going back and forth, trying to explain why they should figure it out themselves. 2 minutes later, the problem's gone, work's moving again, and everyone feels fine. But here's what actually just happened. Business didn't learn how to handle that situation. It learned that when things get uncomfortable, you're the one who makes it go away. So the next question follows the same path. Then the next one. And before long, founders not just leading the company, founders become the person who fields everything, fixes everything, and absorbs everything. And the one everybody's waiting on when something important needs to get decided. And that's usually the moment the business stops feeling like something you're building and it starts feeling like a sack of bricks on your back. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And honestly, where most founders are completely blindsided. Once that starts, the company can keep adding layers and still crack the same way when things get hard. That's what I call false progression. Business can look far more mature than it really is and still be early in how it actually operates when the stakes go up. That's the part that throws people off. Company can have more structure, more meetings, more roles, and more visible activity. But once the real pressure hits, the same dependence is still sitting right there. You're still the one clarifying. You're still the one rescuing. You're still the one has to steady the whole thing when it starts coming apart. That's why growth starts feeling like it's working against you. And by the time most founders figure out why, they've already paid for it. Friction was never actually fixed. It just became more painful to live with. Now there are more people bumping into unclear ownership and more software sitting on top of weak decision flow. All of it stacked on the same founder dependence that was there from the beginning. That's how a business gets more complicated without getting any easier to run. And that can stay hidden for a long time, right up until it costs you something that can't be undone. A lot of businesses look more mature than they are, right up until something slips. Someone needs to actually be held accountable, or two people both think the other one is supposed to make the decision. And that's when the truth shows up. Because standards don't prove themselves when nothing's on the line. And ownership doesn't prove itself when there's no real cost to waiting. The real test only shows up when the pressure's actually in the room. The business still falls back toward the founder at that moment. The business is still running the same way it always did, no matter how mature it looks to everyone else. And the reason it keeps happening is probably not what you think. And this pattern sticks around for a reason. It feels efficient in the moment, and it protects speed for the rest of the afternoon. It avoids discomfort of, watching someone struggle with something you could just solve yourself in like 2 minutes. Cost is real, but you don't fully see it because the founder's the one carrying it. That's why capable founders keep feeding the very problem they say they want to break. And there's really only one thing that breaks that cycle. The map strips away the story, the noise, and the vanity, and forces a much harder question. What stage has this business actually earned? Not what it briefly touched or what sounds good in a conversation, and not what would make the founder feel further along than they actually are. What can this business actually hold consistently when chaos strikes and the pressure's real? Once that's clear, a lot of the confusion starts falling away. And what you can suddenly see is usually the thing that's been costing you the most. You can see the real constraint. You can see what needs to get built next. You can stop treating every pain point like it's equally urgent and deserves the same amount of attention. Doesn't mean the map fixes everything by itself. It means you stop building blind. And without it, most founders spend years solving the wrong problem and never quite figure out why nothing's sticking. A lot of wasted time in growing businesses isn't bad intent or people not working hard enough. It's smart people grinding away on the wrong thing. You're trying to fix an authority problem with software or a founder dependence problem with more meetings. They're trying to solve a sequencing problem with structure copied from a company that was way further along than they actually are. So the business keeps getting better in ways you can see, while the weight never comes off the founder. And that's the part that catches most founders completely off guard. That's the trap. The issue's usually not effort. It's that the next move's getting picked based on what's hurting right now instead of what the business actually needs at this stage. And until that changes, most fixes are still guesses. And the longer that goes on, the harder the real problem gets to solve. The map's not there to get you all fired up. It's there to stop the kind of guesswork that keeps founders building in the wrong order. Because if you don't know what stage you're in, what the real constraint is, and what needs to get built next, you're still building blind. And if the business still needs you there to hold it together, then what you're calling growth may just be a bigger, more expensive version of the same problem you had before. What we just covered is the diagnosis. The next video is the part most founders skip. Because once you understand that the map stops the guessing, the next question pretty much asks itself, what does building out of sequence actually look like inside a real business? That's where we go next. See you in the next video.